In the middle of my wedding, my future mother-in-law took the microphone and said, "Sign over your 10 condos, or this ends right now." I didn't react immediately. I just looked at Olivia. She didn't say a word. That silence told me everything I needed to know. So I let go of her hands, stepped forward, and took the microphone from Margaret Crawford. Then I made 3 announcements of my own. By the time I finished speaking, there was no wedding left to save only a room full of witnesses who finally understood what kind of family I had almost married into. I was still holding Olivia's hands when her mother stood up. At first, I thought something was wrong, a medical issue, maybe. People don't usually walk toward the altar unless something's gone off script. Margaret Crawford, though, didn't look panicked. She moved with purpose, calm, controlled, like she had already decided how this moment would go. A few guests laughed under their breath, the kind of uncertain laugh people give when they're trying to figure out if something is part of the ceremony or a mistake. Reverend Callahan paused mid-sentence, 20 years of weddings, and even he didn't seem sure what he was looking at. His eyes followed her as she walked up the aisle. Heels steady against the wooden platform, posture straight. By the time she reached us, the energy had shifted. Not chaos, not yet. Just tension, thick, quiet, spreading row by row across all 212 guests seated under the late afternoon light at Lakeside Terrace. She extended her hand toward the microphone. There was a hesitation, brief, but noticeable. Then the Reverend handed it to her. That's when I knew this wasn't an interruption. It was a takeover. Margaret turned to face the crowd first. Not me. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone aware that something had gone wrong. Then she pivoted back toward us. Her expression composed, almost polite. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly in mine. I glanced at her. She didn't meet my eyes. And in that small, quiet moment, standing under the arch with 212 people watching, I felt something shift, like the ground beneath this entire day wasn't as solid as I thought it was. Margaret raised the microphone. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying cleanly through the speakers, "if you don't transfer ownership of your 10 condominiums into a joint family structure, this wedding is over. Not postponed, not discussed. Over." The words landed hard, too direct to misunderstand, too deliberate to be taken back. For a second, no one moved. The silence wasn't polite. It wasn't respectful. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes they've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. I didn't look at Margaret again. I looked at Olivia. Her face had gone pale. Her grip on my hands tightened, then loosened, like she didn't know what to do with them. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Nothing. That was the moment. Not her mother's demand, not the shifting crowd, not even the weight of 212 people watching this unfold in real time. It was Olivia's silence, because this didn't come out of nowhere, and if she had wanted to stop it, if she had truly been on my side, this moment would have never made it this far. I waited. She didn't speak. I didn't feel shock. Not really. What I felt was recognition, because this wasn't new, not completely. The language was different, the setting was louder, but the intent, I had heard it before, in softer versions, in suggestions, in conversations that ended with Olivia saying, "She just worries about the family." I looked at her again, this time carefully, not for panic, for confirmation. And I saw it, the hesitation that came a second too late. The way her eyes flicked toward her mother before coming back to me. Not confusion, not surprise, awareness. She knew this was possible. Maybe not today, maybe not like this, but she knew her mother was capable of pushing this line, and she hadn't stopped it. That realization settled in quietly, almost cleanly. There was no point in asking for a private conversation, no pulling her aside, no lowering voices, no pretending this was something we could smooth over behind closed doors. Because if it had reached this point, this stage, this audience, then the real decision had already been made long before we walked down this aisle. I exhaled once and made mine. Before I said anything else, I needed them to understand what was actually being asked of me, because to Margaret, it was just property. To me, it wasn't. My grandfather, Richard Mercer, spent 41 years working as a machinist in a small industrial plant outside Tampa. No shortcuts, no windfalls, just early mornings, overtime shifts, and a discipline that didn't break even when everything else around him did. He bought his first rental unit in 1979, a one-bedroom condo in a building most people overlooked. He didn't talk about it like an investment. He called it a start. 6 years later, he bought another, then 2 more in the early 90s when the market dipped and people were desperate to sell. He never rushed, never leveraged himself beyond what he could control. Every property was paid down methodically, every tenant screened personally for years before he finally handed that responsibility to a management company he trusted. By the time I was in college, he owned 10 condominiums across the Tampa Bay area, all paid off, all stable, all generating income that came in quietly, month after month, exactly the way he designed it to. He drove the same truck for almost 2 decades, ate the same breakfast every morning, wore work shirts until the collars faded. He wasn't interested in looking successful. He was interested in being secure. When I was 23, about 6 months before he died, he asked me to come over. We sat at his kitchen table, same one I'd done homework on growing up. He had a folder in front of him, and his reading glasses halfway down his nose. "I need you to understand what I'm giving you," he said. "Not if, not maybe, what?" He walked me through everything. The properties, the income, the structure, an irrevocable trust. Set up with an estate attorney he'd worked with for years. The kind of structure that couldn't be altered on a whim, couldn't be claimed, merged, or reassigned without my explicit consent. "It protects you," he said, "even from people you think you trust." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. He wasn't. "There will be people," he continued, "who see this and think it should belong to them too, not because they built it, because it's there." He looked at me then, steady and direct. "You need to know the difference between someone who respects what you have and someone who wants access to it." He passed away 4 months later. Everything transferred exactly as he intended. 10 condos, fully managed, generating just under $15,000 a month in rental income. I didn't change my life. I kept working, paid my own rent, built my own career. The trust wasn't a lifestyle, it was a foundation. Something stable, something earned. Just not by me, but entrusted to me. And standing there at the altar, with Margaret holding that microphone, I realized something else. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking me to break the one rule my grandfather had spent 41 years building: don't give control away to people who didn't earn it. Margaret didn't start with ultimatums. She started with suggestions. The first one came about 2 weeks after Olivia told her about the properties. I wasn't there when that conversation happened, I found out later, through Olivia, in that slightly careful tone she used when she knew something might bother me. "My mom thinks it's great," she said. "She just has some ideas." 2 days later, the first one showed up. A forwarded message, long, detailed, structured like something that had been thought through more than casually. Margaret suggested we consider placing the condos into a family LLC. "Tax efficiency," she said, "asset protection, centralized management." She even mentioned someone she knew who could help set it up. I read it twice. Then I told Olivia no, calmly, clearly, no hesitation. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The second attempt came a month later, dressed differently, but carrying the same intention. A prenup, not a standard one, not something balanced or mutual. Margaret had apparently outlined a framework again, through Olivia, that suggested in the event of a divorce, the trust assets would somehow be reintegrated into a shared marital pool. Legally, it didn't make sense, not even remotely. An irrevocable trust doesn't work like that. But it wasn't about legal accuracy. It was about normalization, about introducing the idea often enough that it started to sound reasonable. "She just wants everyone to feel secure," Olivia said. I remember looking at her for a moment longer than usual. "The trust is already secure," I said. "That's the entire point." She nodded, but she didn't push back on her mother. That was the pattern. Soft pressure, then pause, then a new angle. 2 months before the wedding, Margaret shifted strategies, the charm offensive. She started calling me directly, not often but enough to establish a different tone, warmer, friendlier, like we were building something new. She invited me to lunch, twice, sent a gift on my birthday, told me, more than once, that she was so happy Olivia had found someone like me. It was polished, controlled, intentional. And every time we spoke, the topic would come back subtly at first. "Have you thought any more about long-term planning? You know, families that build together tend to stay stronger. Sometimes flexibility early on prevents conflict later." Different phrasing, same direction. I didn't argue. I didn't engage. I just said no. Every time. Calm, consistent, no room for reinterpretation. But what stood out wasn't her persistence. It was Olivia. Because each time Margaret escalated, Olivia adjusted, not toward me, toward her. She doesn't mean it like that. She just worries. She's always been like this. Explanations, translations, never boundaries. That was when I started paying closer attention, not just to what was being said, but to how often I was the only one holding the line. I didn't confront it directly. I didn't need to. Patterns don't require confrontation to be understood. They just require observation. And once you see the cycle clearly, soft pressure, escalation, retreat, repeat, you stop reacting to individual moments. You start preparing for the inevitable one. The shift in my relationship with Olivia didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments, quiet ones that would have been easy to ignore if I hadn't already been paying attention. The first time it really stood out was during a late-night call about wedding logistics. Seating charts, guest lists, timelines, normal things. I mentioned, almost in passing, that I needed her mother to understand that nothing about the trust was changing. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough to register. Then Olivia said, carefully, I mean, what if you compromised a little? I didn't answer right away. Compromised how I asked. Not everything, she said quickly. Just a couple of the condos. 2 or 3, maybe. Something symbolic, so she feels included. Symbolic. I sat there for a second, letting that word settle. 2 or 3 properties. Hundreds of thousands in value. 41 years of someone else's work, reduced to a gesture. For her, she added, so we can move forward without all this tension. That was the moment something in me shifted, not emotionally, but structurally, because it wasn't Margaret speaking anymore. It was Olivia, and she wasn't asking me to protect what I had. She was asking me to give part of it away to make things easier. Not for us, for her mother. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Do you hear what you're asking? I said. She hesitated. I'm asking you to meet us halfway. Us. That word stayed with me, not me and her and her mother, and me on the outside of it. I realized then that Olivia didn't see this as a boundary that needed to be defended. She saw it as a problem that needed to be managed. And I was part of that problem, not the solution. That was when I stopped expecting her to step in, stopped waiting for her to draw a line she had no intention of drawing, because the truth was simple. Even if it took me time to say it, clearly, I wasn't losing control of the situation. I was standing in a relationship where control had never really been mine to begin with. I didn't make a scene when Olivia said that. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just started preparing, not emotionally, logically, because by that point, the pattern was clear enough that I didn't need to guess how this would end. I just didn't know when they would choose to force it, so I made sure I would be ready when they did. The first thing I did was organize everything. Every message Margaret had sent, every forwarded suggestion, every time Olivia had relayed something that wasn't a big deal, I screenshotted, labeled, and saved it all. Dates, context, exact wording. I created a folder on my phone and named it simply Records. It grew steadily over the next few months. The second thing I did was start recording conversations. Not all of them, just the ones that mattered. The ones where tone shifted, where language became careful, where suggestions were framed as compromises. I didn't do it to trap anyone. I did it because I noticed something else happening, something subtle. I would leave conversations with Olivia feeling unclear, like the meaning had shifted mid-sentence, like I had agreed to something I didn't fully agree to. Recording gave me clarity. Facts don't move. Facts don't soften over time. Facts don't get reinterpreted later. 3 weeks before the wedding, I recorded the call, where she suggested giving up just 2 or 3 condos. I listened to it twice after we hung up, then I saved it. The third thing I did was call my grandfather's attorney, Jonathan Hale. He'd been handling the trust since before it was even finalized, knew the structure inside and out, knew exactly why it had been written the way it was. I explained the situation, not emotionally, just the facts. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. Do you expect this to escalate publicly? I thought about it. About Margaret's need for control. About the failed attempts. About the increasing pressure. Yes, I said. There was a short pause on the line. Then you need to be prepared in a way that doesn't rely on assumptions, he said. If something happens, you want it witnessed, documented, clear. I agree, I said. I'll come, he added. We didn't need to say more than that. The week before the wedding passed quietly, almost too quietly. Olivia was attentive, present, like nothing was wrong. Margaret sent a gift, something personalized, carefully chosen, just enough to signal goodwill. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have believed it, but I wasn't operating on impressions anymore. I was operating on patterns. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my apartment, phone on the table, folder open. I went through everything one more time. Messages, screenshots, recordings. 11 months of escalation, preserved in order. My hands were steady, not because I wasn't aware of what could happen, but because I had already made the decision. At that point, the outcome didn't depend on me anymore. It depended on whether they would push far enough to force it. And deep down, I knew they would. I took the microphone from Margaret's hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, like she wasn't expecting resistance, at least not immediate. Not public, but then she let go. 212 people were watching. No one moved. No one spoke. I turned slightly, enough to face both her and the audience. Actually, I said, my voice steady, carrying cleanly across the space. I have a few things to say too. A ripple went through the crowd, quiet, tense, expectant. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. My first announcement is simple, I continued. I'm not transferring anything. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. A murmur moved through the chairs, not loud, but sharp, clear enough to register. I glanced briefly across the row's friends, family, colleagues, people who had come here expecting a wedding, not a negotiation. My grandfather spent over 40 years building those assets, I said. He trusted me to protect them, not to hand them over, because someone else feels entitled to them. Margaret's expression tightened. She stepped slightly closer, like she was about to interrupt. I didn't give her the chance. My second announcement, I said, already reaching into my jacket pocket, is that this didn't come out of nowhere. I pulled out my phone. There was a shift in the air, subtle, but immediate. People leaned forward. Attention sharpened. For the past 11 months, I continued, there have been repeated attempts to pressure me into changing the structure of that trust. I unlocked the screen, opened the folder, records, suggestions, proposals, conversations reframed as compromises. Olivia said my name from behind me, Daniel. I didn't turn around. I asked Olivia multiple times privately if she supported me keeping those assets exactly as they were. I paused. Not for effect, for clarity. She said yes. I looked at her then. She had taken a step forward, just one, close enough to be part of the scene, not far enough to escape it. Her expression wasn't shock. It was something worse, recognition. But 6 weeks ago, I continued. That changed. I tapped the screen, and I recorded it. A visible reaction moved through the crowd now. Not noise, not chaos. Just a tightening, like everyone had just recalibrated what they were witnessing. I lifted the phone slightly. Then I pressed play. Her voice came through the speakers, clear, undeniable. Maybe if you just gave up 2 or 3 of the condos, she'd relax. We could all move forward. No distortion, no ambiguity, just the truth, exactly as it had been said. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. Not confusion, understanding. Margaret stepped toward me, her voice sharp now. You have no right to do this. Yes, I said, cutting across her without raising my volume. I do. I lowered the phone. You tried to force a private concession by making a public demand. I continued. All I'm doing is responding in the same setting. She stopped, not because she agreed, because she realized she'd lost control of the frame. I let that moment sit for a second, then I continued. My third announcement, I said, is that this wedding is canceled. There it was, no hesitation, no build-up, just a statement. I heard a sharp intake of breath somewhere in the audience. Olivia stepped forward fully this time. Daniel, wait, I looked at her. Not angry, not emotional, just clear. I'm not going to marry someone who watches me get pressured like this, I said, and calls it compromise. Her face shifted, something breaking through. Too late to matter. Margaret was speaking again, faster now, louder. Something about family, about what I was throwing away. I barely registered the words. They didn't apply anymore. I turned slightly, looking out at the crowd. The reception is already paid for, I said. Please stay. Enjoy the evening. None of this is your responsibility. A strange stillness settled over the space, like the entire room had collectively realized there was nothing left to fix. No version of this, where the ceremony resumed. No version where this rewound. I handed the microphone back to Margaret, not because she deserved it, but because I was done using it. Then I stepped back, away from the arch, away from the expectation of what this day was supposed to be. And for the first time since she stood up, I felt something close to quiet. Not relief, not yet, but clarity, the kind that doesn't leave room for second guessing. Before anyone could fill the silence, a chair shifted in the third row. Jonathan Hale stood up. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There's a certain kind of authority that comes from decades of experience, and from knowing exactly where the law stands. He stepped into the aisle, adjusting his jacket once, then looked directly at Margaret. For the record, he said, his tone measured. I am the attorney who structured Mr. Mercer's trust. That changed the room. You could feel it. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was something else entirely, something with weight, with consequence. The trust in question, he continued, is irrevocable. It was specifically designed to prevent external influence, including marital or familial pressure, from altering its structure. Margaret opened her mouth, but he didn't stop. Any attempt to coerce the beneficiary into transferring or restructuring those assets, particularly in a public or conditional context, can be interpreted as undue influence. A pause, not long, just long enough for the words to land. And in this case, he added, there are witnesses. That was the moment it shifted completely, from drama to documentation, from emotion to liability. Margaret's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. The confidence she had walked up with wasn't there anymore. She wasn't controlling the situation now. She was standing inside something she couldn't talk her way out of. Jonathan gave a small nod, then stepped back. No theatrics, no escalation, just a clear, final statement. And with that, whatever argument Margaret thought she was making ended. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to add. Margaret was still standing there, holding the microphone she no longer controlled. Olivia hadn't moved. The guests remained seated, caught somewhere between witnessing and processing. I stepped down from the platform, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. The same aisle I had walked 20 minutes earlier, lined with flowers, framed by sunlight, filled with expectation, felt different now. Quieter, clearer, no music, no ceremony. Just the sound of my own footsteps against the wooden floor. I didn't look back. Not at Olivia, not at Margaret, not at the arch, where this was supposed to become something permanent. Because turning around would have implied hesitation, and there wasn't any. As I moved past the rows of chairs, I could feel the weight of 12 people watching, but it didn't pull at me the way it might have before. It didn't matter anymore. By the time I reached the end of the aisle, the air felt different. Cooler, cleaner, like stepping out of something that had already ended before I ever had to say it out loud. The first few minutes outside were quiet, not empty, just quiet in a way that lets everything settle without forcing it. I walked past the edge of the terrace, toward the lake. The air felt cooler there, cleaner, like stepping into a space that hadn't been touched by what just happened. I stopped near the water and took a breath, then another. No shaking, no second guessing, just stillness. Camille, Olivia's cousin, the only one in that family who had ever spoken to me like a normal person, was the first to come out. She didn't say anything at first, just walked up, stood next to me, and looked out at the lake. Then she said, quietly, "You did the right thing." I nodded. Once. I know. She stayed for another minute, then squeezed my shoulder, and went back inside. A few minutes later, Jonathan came out. He didn't ask how I was. He already knew. Instead, he sat down on a nearby bench and gestured for me to join him. I did. He folded his hands, thoughtful, based on what I heard. He said, "And what you've documented, there's a case to be made that her actions could qualify as coercive behavior." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't understand, but because hearing it framed that way made it official. Not personal, not emotional, legal. I assumed as much. I said. He nodded. "I'll review everything in detail," he added, "if necessary. We can send a formal notice, set clear boundaries moving forward." "Do it," I said. There was no hesitation in that answer. Inside, I could still hear the faint movement of people's voices rising and falling, the low hum of confusion turning into conversation. Life continuing, just not the version that had been planned. My phone buzzed, then again and again. I didn't check it immediately. I already knew who it was. When I finally looked, there were 6 messages from Olivia. Then 8, then more. Apologies, questions, explanations. "Can we talk? Please don't do this like this." I didn't know she was going to say it like that. I read them all once, then I locked my phone. Not because I was angry, but because none of it changed anything. About 20 minutes later, Jonathan stood. "I'll follow up tomorrow," he said. I nodded. "Thanks for coming." He gave a small, almost approving look. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing," he said. Then he left. I stayed a little longer, watched the light shift across the water. Listened to the distant sound of chairs moving, people leaving, the slow unraveling of an event that had already collapsed. By the time I walked to my car, my phone had 17 messages, all from Olivia. The last one was longer, different tone, trying to explain everything at once: her mother, the pressure, the timing, the misunderstanding. I didn't reply. Not that night, not the next day, not at all. Because there are situations where a conversation can fix something. And there are situations where the conversation is just an attempt to undo what's already been clearly revealed. This was the second kind. A week later, Jonathan sent the letter. Formal, precise. Any further contact regarding the trust or its assets would be considered harassment and handled accordingly. Margaret didn't respond. But 3 weeks after that, she sent a single message. I hope you understand what you've destroyed. I read it once, then forwarded it to Jonathan and deleted it, because what she thought I destroyed wasn't mine to protect. What I protected was. 3 months later, the noise was gone. No more messages, no more pressure, no more attempts to reframe what had happened. Just space, the kind you don't realize you've been missing until it's there. I moved into a new apartment on the north side of the city. Top floor, east-facing windows, morning light that came in clean and early. The kind that makes it easier to start the day without thinking too much about the one before it. I paid for everything myself. Rent, furniture, utilities. The trust didn't touch any of it. That mattered to me more than I expected. Not because I had something to prove to anyone else, but because I needed to be clear with myself about what was mine to build and what was mine to protect. I went back to work the following Monday. Same projects, same deadlines, nothing dramatic. And that was exactly what I needed. Normalcy, when it's real, is underrated. I also started seeing someone, Dr. Elaine Porter, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted clarity. The kind that doesn't shift depending on how a conversation is framed. She asked direct questions, didn't rush to conclusions, didn't soften things that didn't need softening. During one of the early sessions, she asked, "When Olivia asked you to give up part of the properties, what did that represent to you?" I thought about it. "Control," I said. She nodded slightly, and when she framed it as compromise, that it wasn't mine to keep, I replied. There was a pause. "And was that true?" she asked. "No," I said. "That was the first time I said it that clearly. Not just about the properties, about the relationship. Because looking back, it wasn't one moment that defined it. It was a pattern. Olivia wasn't a bad person. She wasn't malicious. She was adaptive. To her mother, to conflict, to pressure. She had spent most of her life learning how to maintain stability by adjusting herself to whatever made things easier. And in doing that, she expected the same from me, not consciously, but consistently. That's what I missed at the beginning, because warmth can look a lot like compatibility, until something important is at stake. And then you see what holds and what shifts. I don't feel anger when I think about it now, just a kind of quiet understanding. She did what she knew how to do, and I did what I had to do. Both can be true without needing to rewrite the outcome. There are moments, usually early in the morning, when the apartment is still quiet, when I think about how close it all came to going differently, how easy it would have been to say yes, to give a little, to keep the peace. And every time that thought comes up, it ends the same way, with the same conclusion. I didn't lose anything that was actually mine. I just stopped pretending something else was. What I didn't expect was how far the story would travel. Not publicly, not in any official way, but through people, conversations, connections. About 2 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from one of Olivia's cousins. We'd only spoken a handful of times before, nothing significant. She didn't waste time with small talk. "She's always been like that," she said. I knew who she meant. "I'm sorry it happened to you," she added. "It wasn't an apology I needed, but it told me something. This wasn't new. It was just the first time someone hadn't gone along with it." A few days later, a friend from college reached out. She had been at the wedding, said she couldn't stop thinking about it. "I've been dealing with something similar for years," she admitted. "I just didn't have a name for it." We talked for almost an hour, not about details, but about patterns. Pressure that doesn't look like pressure at first. Compromise that only moves in one direction. Silence that says more than any argument. Then there was a message from someone I didn't know. A friend of a friend. She asked how I had organized everything: messages, recordings, timelines. So I sent her the system. Simple, structured, clear. She replied a few hours later. "Thank you," she wrote. "I needed to see this was possible." That part stayed with me. Not the wedding, not the confrontation, but the idea that walking away, cleanly, completely, could shift something for someone else. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was decisive. And sometimes, that's all it takes for someone else to realize they're allowed to do the same. My grandfather used to say something that didn't make much sense to me when I was younger. Not because it was complicated, because it sounded too simple. "The hard part isn't building something," he told me once. "It's knowing when to protect it." At the time, I thought he was talking about money, about investments, about risk. I understand now that he wasn't. He was talking about people, because the truth is, most of the time, you won't be asked to give everything away all at once. It doesn't happen like that. It happens in pieces, small adjustments, reasonable compromises, things that seem harmless on their own, but together, slowly shift ownership from you to someone else. Not just of what you have, but of what you decide, what you tolerate, what you're willing to stand on. That's the part no one explains clearly. That the line isn't where the demand becomes unreasonable. It's where you stop being the one in control of the answer. I stood at that line once, in front of 212 people, with everything set up to move forward, and I chose not to. Not because it was easy, but because it was clear. You can love someone, you can see the good in them, you can understand why they are the way they are, and still recognize that they are not someone you can build a life with, especially if that life requires you to give up the very thing that defines how you live it. My grandfather spent 41 years building something meant to last. All I had to do was not give it away to the wrong people. If this story made you think differently about boundaries, control, or relationships, consider sharing it or following for more.